is Monday, September 30th, International Podcast Day. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Winunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. A happy International Podcasting Day to you, Jill.
Moshe, have an amazing day, fellow podcaster. Celebrate, enjoy
It's not
it.
just National Podcast Day. It is International Podcast Day. Jill, there's a website, internationalpodcastday.com. It tells me that I didn't know about this holiday till like a second ago, that in 2014, National Podcast Day was celebrated after realizing the power of podcasts internationally. They rebranded it International Podcast Day. So thanks to all of you who celebrate Podcast Day Monday through Friday with us here on the Mo News Podcast and all the other podcasts that you listen to.
And good for the podcasting community for understanding that there should just be one global day to celebrate everyone. We were talking last week about there was National Daughter Day, World Daughter Day, and it's like, just do it on one day.
The podcasting world appears to have gotten its act together, Jill. So, give an extra shout out to the podcasts, your favorite podcasts, including ours, on social media, et cetera, today.
And on a serious note, Moshe, I know that you and I have both been in journalism a long time. I was a longtime TV anchor, news reporter. I've written a lot of things, and I can say that by far, my favorite thing that I have done is podcasting. I think you're able to build such an intimate connection with the community. And so I take just so much joy out of podcasting every day.
Jill, it's a lot of fun. And with that, we have a lot to get to from this weekend, including some serious headlines.
That's right. Let's get to the news here. Widespread devastation across the American Southeast after the deadly Hurricane Helene, from devastation in Florida to mudslides and flooding in North Carolina that has cut off entire cities like Asheville. We'll have the latest. Overseas, the fallout and what comes next after the Israelis assassinated the longtime leader of Hezbollah over the weekend, the concern over a larger regional war, and why some aren't so worried about it. We're 24 hours away from the Veep debate, how J.D. Vance and Tim Walz are preparing, and why one of them says they are super nervous.
Super nervous, like telling their advisors to tell the media that they're super nervous.
It's got to be Tim Walz, right?
You had a 50% chance of being right, and you are correct. Yes.
Growing concern about young men in America. Some new statistics on how many are living at home, lonely and aimless into their 30s. A major port strike that could shut down all 36 major commercial seaports from Maine to Texas. We talk about the potential economic impact. Why the governor of California vetoed some legislation to regulate AI over the weekend. SNL season 50 premieres with a focus on what else? The election, the highlights from Saturday night.
Dana Carvey is back, Jill.
And Moshe has on this day in history.
Mariah Carey makes huge history on this day, Jill. Like history for all womankind when it comes to music.
Mariah Carey's a Long Islander. Just throwing it out there.
There you go.
Okay, let's get to the news. The U.S. Southeast grappled Sunday with rising death tolls, a lack of vital supplies in isolated flood-stricken areas, and the widespread loss of homes and property, while the devastating toll of Hurricane Helene became clear to officials who warned of a lengthy and difficult rebuild. More than 80 people have been killed in total. Several million people were still without power Sunday afternoon. In North Carolina, the governor, Roy Cooper, said on Sunday that the toll of 11 dead in his state was expected to climb as rescuers and other emergency workers reached areas in the western part of the state, isolated by collapsed roads, failing infrastructure, and widespread flooding. Cooper is imploring residents to avoid traveling on roads in western North Carolina, not only to avoid dangers, but to keep roads clear for emergency vehicles. More than 50 search teams have been spread out throughout the region. They're in search of stranded people. Western North Carolina is isolated by landslides and flooding that forced the closure of Interstate 40 and other roads. There have been hundreds of water rescues, none more dramatic than in rural Unicoi County in East Tennessee, where dozens of patients and staff were plucked by helicopter from a hospital rooftop on Friday. The storm has upended life throughout the Southeast. Authorities were rushing to airlift supplies and restore communications and roads in flooded Asheville. Asheville does not currently have running water. The state is sending water supplies and other items toward Buncombe County and Asheville, but mudslides blocking Interstate 40 and other highways are preventing the supplies from getting there. Beyond North Carolina, at least 24 people are dead in South Carolina, including 2 firefighters. In Georgia, at least 17 people have died, 2 of them killed by a tornado. And then in Florida, at least 11 people have been killed.
Yeah, Jill, just terrible stories that we're getting over the weekend from across the region. In Georgia, Governor Kemp there says it looked like a bomb went off in certain areas. Augusta, Georgia, actually had to turn off the water for up to 48 hours. So we're just hearing story by story, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and then, of course, Florida, the epicenter of where it came ashore. Back to North Carolina, though, we told a number of these stories over the weekend on the Mo News Premium Instagram account. About 300 roads are closed across North Carolina. Another 150 are closed in South Carolina. Effectively, Western North Carolina cut off, though we did hear from some people who figured out a way to make it out. A word to the wise, if you're disaster planning, or frankly planning any day, make sure you have a printed out roadmap in your vehicle, especially with cell reception, et cetera, going down. Pretend you're in the pre-Google Map era. It's one key thing you should make sure you have in your kids' cars and in your vehicle, should you ever deal with this type of situation. In speaking with people in the area, a reminder, Western North Carolina, Tennessee, these people are 300 miles inland. They were not expecting apocalyptic damage, though we did tell you on this podcast to be concerned about flooding. Though this is beyond the imagination, what they're calling a 1 in 1,000 year type flood. When we say, or when you hear 1 in 1,000 years, it basically means that this type of weather event has a 0.1% chance of happening, a 1/1000th chance of happening, hence 1 in 1,000 years. But now events that used to have a 0.1% chance now have a 1% or 5% chance of happening, which means you're now going to see them instead of once in a millennia, once in a decade. So there are a number of people missing right now in the thousands. It sort of reminds us of Lahaina, what was going on in Maui last year. People just can't get in touch. And so what you'll see, ideally, is that while you see it in the thousands, it'll go down to fewer and fewer people as cell phone reception comes up here. They've tried to make Starlink satellites available to people. That's something FEMA is working on to ensure people can actually access their data. Right now, again, no cell, no power, no passable roads. A lot of people unable to connect with their loved ones in the area. Meanwhile, down in Florida, that's where Hurricane Helene first came ashore on the Gulf Coast there, the Big Bend area of Florida. One of the hardest hit areas was the small town of Steinhatchee, which was overwhelmed by a 10-foot storm surge, 140-mile-per-hour winds. Most of the residents of that town evacuated the area. They returned to their homes, though, in recent days to find their homes, businesses gone. Authorities say it's basically been wiped off the map, this small town. A well-known restaurant there, Roy's Restaurant, had just rebuilt from Hurricane Idalia last year, which destroyed the area. Now the restaurant owner says she will rebuild again after rebuilding from Idalia, seeing it destroyed again this past week. They're going to rebuild again. A reminder, the Big Bend area here of Florida, in 13 months, they've seen 3 hurricanes, 2 major ones. Helene, I mentioned Idalia, and they also had Hurricane Debbie, which brought major flooding to Florida last month. Another town in Florida that saw major devastation, Cedar Key, that's about 60 miles from Gainesville, an island there. Law enforcement has estimated that about 25% of the homes on the island have been destroyed. Jill, in some of these areas, they're saying recovery might not happen in months, but needs to be counted in years.
Yeah, just heartbreaking stuff, and sending our thoughts to anybody affected by this storm.
Jill, among the organizations that are already on the scene there, Team Rubicon, that's a charity that's veterans-led that does disaster relief. The American Red Cross is also there. There are a number of organizations you could give to help out, but right now they're still in the recovery mode and in the rescue mode in some of these areas.
All right, Moshe, now to a huge story overseas. Major headlines out of the Middle East this weekend as Israel assassinated Hassan Nasrallah. He is the man who led the Hezbollah terror group in Lebanon for the last 3 decades. It comes as the Israeli military has effectively taken out the entire top leadership of the group over the last few weeks, shocking Hezbollah and their top supporter, Iran. Nasrallah was taken out in a massive airstrike in suburban Beirut Friday with bunker busters. Nasrallah and the senior leadership assassinated have built up the terror group into the most powerful, richest terror group in the world. They've become a potent and influential domestic political force in Lebanon as well. and a potent regional military power with ballistic missiles that threaten Tel Aviv. In recent weeks, Israel had carried out repeated airstrikes in that same area to kill other top Hezbollah commanders, including some of the founding members who had been with the organization since it was established in the early 1980s. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said, quote, "We settled the score with the one responsible for the murder of countless Israelis and many citizens of other countries, including hundreds of Americans and dozens of French." While the U.S. was not involved in the strike, President Biden called the killing a, quote, "measure of justice" to the many American families whose loved ones had been killed by the terrorist group. Until al-Qaeda attacked the U.S. on 9/11, Hezbollah was the terror group responsible for killing the most Americans, and that includes several hundred Americans and U.S. troops in bombings in the early 1980s. Nasrallah took over the group in 1992 after an Israeli rocket killed his predecessor. He was mourned by some fellow Shiite Muslims in Lebanon and Iran, as well as across Gaza and the West Bank among Palestinians who looked to him for support in their war on Israel. Though Nasrallah's death was also celebrated by those in the Iranian reform movement in Israel, it was also celebrated in Syria among rebels who saw Nasrallah and Hezbollah aid dictator Bashar al-Assad as he murdered scores of Syrians looking for democratic reforms in the country during the decades-long civil war. It was one of the ways that Nasrallah extended the group's reach well beyond Lebanon. Hezbollah fighters were instrumental in shoring up the government of Assad next door in Syria when it was threatened by that popular uprising. Hezbollah has helped train Hamas fighters as well as terrorists in Iraq and Yemen. Israel looked to maintain the momentum with continued strikes on Sunday, looking to take out as much of Hezbollah's infrastructure as they can. It's a response to months of Hezbollah attacks in the aftermath of the Hamas October 7th attack last year, which has forced up to 100,000 Israelis to have to abandon their homes in the last year. Israel says their goal is to push Hezbollah back off the border and to allow Israelis to return to their homes.
Yeah, so Hezbollah has been launching thousands of missiles and rockets on Israel. There have been talks to get them to stop, to basically separate them from Hamas. Hezbollah has said, no, we're intent on destroying Israel. We're going to help our brothers in Hamas here. And Israel said the time was limited for diplomacy, and it appears they took the gloves off here. In the past couple of weeks, Jill, it was just less than 2 weeks ago, was that walkie-talkie pager bombing, then multiple assassination on assassination here. Clearly, the Israelis had infiltrated Hezbollah here. They've taken out a number of key sites, weapons that they had, very advanced weapons that they got from Iran. And then culminating with the assassination of the Hezbollah leader, Nasrallah, who was deep in his bunker and thought he was safe in his bunker. It turns out the Israelis had bunker busters and were able to get to him on Friday. Some background here. The Israelis were actually looking to do this last October in the aftermath of the October 7th attack. There was a whole push within the Israeli government to say, we got to take out Hezbollah infrastructure first because they're more powerful than Hamas in the aftermath of the Hamas attack. And in fact, according to multiple reports over the weekend, the Israelis had planes in the air ready to launch these strikes in the days after last October 7th. And due to pushback from, among others, President Biden, the focus was to remain Hamas in Gaza for a number of months there. But the Israelis have been taking incoming here from Hezbollah. Hezbollah has refused to stop, and so the Israelis have just unleashed here. They've put Hezbollah in a state of shock, taken out more leaders of Hezbollah than in the entire 40 years organization have been taken out in just a week and a half here. And like you said, Hezbollah was Iran's key proxy group in the region, basically doing the fighting so the Iranian government does not have to, training the Houthis, training Hamas, training other groups here, involved in the civil war in Syria. And that appears to have been where they might have been infiltrated a bit by Israeli agents, according to some reports here. The Israelis, by the way, not stopping in Lebanon over the weekend. They also launched a strike on Yemen, a pretty unprecedented strike on a major port there where Iran brings in weapons to the Iranians. It came as the Houthis launched a missile at the international airport in Israel over the weekend, just as Netanyahu was landing. And so the Israelis responded here with a major strike. By the way, that missile on Israel, the Israelis were able to intercept with their various air defense systems, and parts fell to the ground. But back to Hezbollah here. They have sustained blow after blow in the last few weeks. Nasrallah said last year, in the aftermath of October 7th, that this was going to be the beginning of the end for Israel. This marked a huge victory, and ultimately they would win. It appears Nasrallah here has made a couple major mistakes that has ended in his death on Friday and severe damage to his group, where the foremost strategy is survival. One, he grossly underestimated Israel, and two, overestimated his abilities and that of Iran. Iran here has basically said, you guys do the fighting so we don't have to. Hezbollah's asked for aid here, and Iran has not gotten very involved in this because what's Iran's goal in all of this? Also regime survival. And as they've watched what's unfolded here in recent weeks, as Israel's taken the gloves off, assassinated the leader of Hamas in Tehran, launched a strike taking out top Iranian leadership in Syria that led to that back and forth in April. And now these recent strikes on Hezbollah, Iran has gotten a bit of whiplash here as to what happens. And so you still have Hezbollah, by the way, which we should mention, has thousands of fighters, has a vast arsenal of missiles, rockets, precision-guided ballistic missiles, which the Israelis are trying to find here. That was all meant to deter Israel. It appears the Israelis were not deterred here, and the Hezbollah weapons in the past week and a half haven't killed a single Israeli, as the Israelis have been able to intercept them in the air. And as far as Iran here, it's demonstrated that its unity on all fronts, their access against Israel, is a one-way street. The groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, they'll get money from Iran, they'll get weapons from Iran, but Iran ain't supporting them beyond that with the Iranian military, which we should note is pretty large. So inside Iran, what we're learning is the Ayatollah Khamenei, who's in his mid-80s, has had meetings among senior leadership about what to do next. He's got some, hardcore people who say you need to attack Israel to save face. He has a lot of people, including the new president of Iran, who's under him, Pezeshkian, who says, no, we need to sit back here. We don't know what the Israelis are capable of. They could attack Tehran. They could take out our nuclear sites. I don't know that we should respond. So far, you're seeing them not respond. The Ayatollah put a statement saying that any response to this assassination will be determined by Hezbollah. That'll determine the fate of the region. Basically saying, you guys are on your own. We do not want to face an all-out war here.
Moshe, the one thing that is very clear, as we mentioned last week, is that this war with Hezbollah is the one that Israel has been preparing for years, since 2006, actually, since they last fought a war. Their intelligence was better. They view Hezbollah as the existential threat, not Hamas, which is why you see, in 10 days is why you're able to basically see them take out the entirety of their top leadership and a lot of their missiles and whatnot. And yet we're caught very off guard by that attack by Hamas.
Right. The sense is, and of course the Israelis are going to have their own hearings, their version of Capitol Hill hearings, to find out what exactly happened there, is that it appears here the focus for the Israelis was Iran could eliminate this country. Hezbollah is much more powerful. They focused their intelligence presence. They created that fake company out of Hungary to build pagers and walkie-talkies. They played the long game here with Hezbollah and dismissed the threat from Hamas. We should note Hamas was also putting forth the image when they were playing the long game that they were in it for diplomacy, that they were going to be a responsible governing entity. They were looking for visas for Gazans to be able to work inside Israel. And so that strategy sort of softened Israel. So when they started to get intel that Hamas was planning something big, you had people in the Israeli government being like, no, we got that handled. Let's focus on Hezbollah. So now you're seeing the aftermath of that focus on Hezbollah from that 2006 war, where Israel was able to achieve some things, but ultimately it was deadly for Israel there as they tried to push back the group from the border. And so Israel reset and said they will not let that happen again. So now what happens next? You're going to see a lot of headlines here about the concern for regional war. Ultimately, that's predicated on Iran here and what Iran does. And like we're saying, it appears right now the more quote-unquote moderate voices inside Iran, those moderate voices being like, we don't want all-out war. That's how we define moderate these days. Say, Israel might take out our critical infrastructure, our power plants. Like, we have no idea what they're capable of because clearly they don't care anymore. There are no red lines for Netanyahu, that ultimately it's about survival for them. And so does Iran have an interest in regional war? No. They still haven't responded to the assassination of the Hamas leader inside Tehran. That happened almost 2 months ago now. And now you have the killing of Nasrallah. Notably in the U.S., Jill, of two minds about this. No tears are being shed for Nasrallah for obvious reasons. In the U.S., the White House sees the death here as a huge blow to the group, a huge opportunity for Lebanon to free itself a bit from Hezbollah's strength. At the same time, there is concern in the U.S. about regional war and that, this whole idea of the Israeli strategy of de-escalation through escalation still has a lot of folks concerned in the U.S. government.
All right, time for the speed read. Let's start with politics. This from CNN. The vice presidential debate is set for tomorrow night between Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. The debate will be moderated by CBS News, but available to watch on all networks and platforms. CNN reports that Tim Walz is telling people he's nervous about facing J.D. Vance. He had told Harris before she chose him that he was a bad debater. The vice presidential debate Tuesday is likely to be the last marquee event before Election Day, with many voters still saying they don't know enough about Harris. It could be up to Walz to help convince them to trust the vice president he barely knew himself before she picked him. Walz reportedly telling aides that he is worried about letting Harris down. Walz is a former high school teacher. He apparently told a group of Democratic donors recently that, quote, as teachers, we are trained to answer the question and we train our students to answer the questions. But that's not how debates go.
Oh, no, Tim Walz. Answering the questions is the first mistake, at least as far as typical political wisdom is concerned.
His team has been holding mock sessions with Pete Buttigieg playing J.D. Vance. Their plan is to largely skip Vance in the debate and instead focus on Trump. At the same time, their worry is that Vance is going to eviscerate the governor's genuine dad joke persona and make Walz come across as either a moron or a raging bull or even an out-of-whack liberal vouching for another out-of-whack liberal.
Yeah, that's the worst fear in the Walz camp. At the same time, they want to paint J.D. Vance as out of the mainstream, pin him to his controversial remarks about cat ladies, all the variety of controversial things that J.D. Vance has said in recent weeks. It is interesting, Jill, that report is coming out via CNN. Wouldn't be surprised if that's coming out from the Tim Walz camp on purpose to lower expectations. A reminder here ahead of debates. It's all about saying your opponent is amazing and you suck. So if you suck in the debate, they're like, well, we knew he was going to suck going in. So, he met expectations. So there's this expectations game that is played with the media here. That said, we should know Tim Walz, 12 years in the U.S. House, 6 years as governor. He has more governmental experience than George W. Bush had, than Barack Obama had as president going into the VP slot. So, that's something. That's something notable here to keep in mind as he tries to set expectations. On the other side, you have Congressman Tom Emmer. He's in the House leadership on the Republican side. He's from Minnesota. He's been helping Vance prepare, effectively giving him the scoop on how Tim Walz works. Tom Emmer was on a Sunday show over the weekend talking about their strategy, talking about how they're going to take on the governor's folksy personality. This is what Emmer said they can expect from Vance. These arguments that Trump fixed the economy and Harris and Biden broke the economy, that Trump fixed the border and Harris broke the border, that Trump had stability in the world and Harris and Biden have brought instability to the world. That's the core argument they're going to try to make there. Keep in mind the way the VP debate works, as you sort of laid out there in the beginning. You don't even really respond to the opponent because they're not going to be president. You go after the number one on the ticket. So expect J.D. Vance to mention Kamala Harris way more times than he mentions Tim Walz, and expect Tim Walz to mention Trump way more times than he mentions J.D. Vance. They'll basically look over each other tomorrow night. It comes, by the way, as Trump continues to ramp up attacks on Harris over the weekend. He called her and Joe Biden mentally disabled over the weekend in a new attack that's actually getting some criticism internally from some Republicans as going too far. Trump said at a rally, Biden became mentally impaired. Kamala Harris, she was born that way. There's something wrong with her. It reinforces some things you've heard from Trump of late. He calls Harris stupid, weak, dumb as a rock. And so now he's added mentally impaired here, which again has gotten some backlash from a variety of corners. We should note, going back to the VP debate here, Vance does have a challenge here. He is the least liked of the four major personalities. Right now, Vance's favorability rating is at only 27% nationally. And even among Republicans, he has a 51% favorable ratings, meaning 49% of Republicans don't like J.D. Vance, whereas Tim Walz has a 42% overall favorability, and he's liked by 72% of Democrats. The bottom line, though, Jill, the VP debate, it only matters if one of these guys really just like falls back and like crashes, like maybe literally or, rhetorically. Like nobody's going to remember that. Like if you forgot the Harris-Trump debate at this point, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, maybe it made a difference. The polling shows no. The VP debate is even more insignificant. It's interesting, especially for those of us who watch politics. But again, I don't know what long-term impact we could expect from this.
Moshe, the only thing that I remember still from Mike Pence's debate against Kamala Harris is the fly.
There was a fly on his hat.
And immediately there was a Twitter account, the fly on Mike Pence's hair.
Like, what are your memories of the Tim Kaine Mike Pence debate in 2016? What are your memories of the Paul Ryan Joe Biden debate of 2012? 2008, you might remember because Sarah Palin had to recover from her interviews, which she did in that debate. She's like, "Hey, Joe, can I call you Joe?" in the Sarah Palin Joe Biden debate. But ultimately, that election did not come down to the VP debate between Joe Biden and Sarah Palin. So anyway, I could go back. Do you remember the John Edwards Dick Cheney debate?
Moshe, if that was not a rhetorical question, the answer is no. I don't.
Jill, one of the groups we should mention Vance is really trying to appeal to right now is young men. They have some new ads out targeting Tim Walz for a tax he put on tobacco, including on Zyn. Zyn is very popular among Gen Z men. The Trump campaign, the Trump Vance campaign have put out some Jake Paul ads, really targeting Gen Z men. We've told you on this podcast, they are the least likely to show up to vote. But if they do, it will be a key boost here to Trump and Vance.
Speaking of young men, Moshe, a story about how young men are falling behind caught our attention this weekend from the Wall Street Journal. The life trajectories of America's sons and daughters are diverging. Presented with a more equal playing field, young women are seizing the opportunities in front of them while young men are floundering. The phenomenon's developed over the past decade, but was supercharged by the pandemic, which derailed careers, schooling, and isolated friends and families. And the result has had big implications for the economy. More women, ages 25 to 34, have entered the workforce in recent years than ever. The share of young men in the labor market, meanwhile, has not grown in a decade. Nearly 20% of men in that age group, 25 to 34, still live with their parents, compared to 12% of women. Men have always been more prone to live with their parents than young women, but that number has increased in the last decade. While women now expect to have more and better opportunities than their mothers and grandmothers, men are in some ways bracing for the opposite. Researchers say that it's created a crisis of purpose, especially for men at the entrance to adulthood.
So we got some of the first clues about this a few years ago when educators and higher education administrators were saying, we have plummeting college attendance. We are like struggling right now to get a 50-50 split at universities, even a 60-40 split, women to men. And so now that group that we heard warnings about not going to college, not being able to get into college 10 years ago, are now in their late 20s, early 30s. And the feelings of aimlessness are spilling into social, professional realms here. It's hitting dating and relationships, and it's also hitting the economy here. And then you have a lot of stats here that are concerning. Young men are lonelier as a result. Men 18 to 30 spent 18% more time alone last year, an average of nearly 7 non-sleeping hours alone. That's an increase over 2019 and 22% higher than women their age. So even more time alone among men in their 20s here. The suicide rate among men 25 to 34 is up 30% over the course of the last decade. That's according to the CDC here. And that's the biggest increase among any age group. So Jill, young men being left behind here. We hit a bit of this in the Jonathan Haidt Mo News interview podcast a few months ago. And we were talking there about the social media impact, especially among young women, slightly higher suicide rate increase there, but still concerning data when it comes to men. And even when I talked to Jonathan Haidt about his book, and I was like, what have you learned in recent months since you published? And he says we need to be focused even more right now on the impact of all of this. Changes in society, parenting, devices, social media, programming. We need to be concerned about the young men in this country right now.
Scott Galloway talks about this a lot, and he says that one of the problems is that as soon as you start to talk about men and kind of like that they are having problems, a lot of people roll their eyes because they're just like, okay, men, sorry, it's women's turn now. You had it good. Yes. Men. But if you want to turn it around and make it about women, he does point out in terms of just simply the numbers and mating that men are a lot more likely to just say date somebody or marry someone who doesn't have an equal education background or who makes less money than them. Women are not like that. According to the data, women are a lot less likely to say, if they graduated college, to want to marry a man who didn't graduate college. So there are huge implications just in terms of families, in terms of how many children we're having, society. Yeah. Exactly. So a really big and important issue.
You might argue that, and I've heard it argued that like there may have been an overcorrection here, that it was important to create these programs for underprivileged groups, women, etc. But it might be time to consider some programming around men at this point, given some of the stats that we're seeing.
All right, from Bloomberg, all eyes on a breakthrough to prevent a massive port workers strike. If it happens, it could have a far-reaching effect on the American economy. Over the weekend, key industry and government officials urged U.S. dock workers and their employers to avoid a strike on all 36 East and Gulf Coast ports this week. Although many facilities are already bracing for a shutdown, the U.S. Maritime Alliance, a group that represents ocean carriers and port terminal operators, and the International Longshoremen's Association have no talks planned before their contract expires at midnight tonight. The stalemate sets the stage for a strike to start tomorrow, forcing ports with the combined capacity to handle as much as half of all U.S. trade volumes to halt container cargo and auto shipments. Energy supplies and bulk cargo like municipal waste and road salt won't be affected, and some exceptions will be made to allow for the movement of military goods and cruise ships.
President Biden said yesterday he will not intervene in any dock worker strike as of right now, though, Jill, when this inevitably starts, overnight tonight, resolving this dispute is going to be a huge matter, and don't know how long the White House is going to be able to sit this one out. Now, as of right now, the White House says this is an issue for collective bargaining. To help break the impasse, they did summon the employer group, the union here, to the White House on Friday for a meeting, urging them to return to negotiations here. They're demanding an 80% increase in wages over the next 6 years. They want more of a cut into the profits that they've seen at the ports from these companies. The ports are offering an increase, but not as much as they're demanding. That's usually how these things go. Biden has promoted himself as the most pro-union president. He's maintained that he's not going to interfere here and get involved and basically force a deal on the unions. There is a law called the Taft-Hartley Act that presidents have the ability to force an agreement to prevent strikes like this. President Bush, 43, used it about 20 years ago to prevent a strike at the ports. We'll see if Biden decides to invoke that, should there be no agreement here. Right now, analyses show that the strike would impact the U.S. economy by about $5 to $7.5 billion a week. Now, some businesses have been prepping, larger businesses getting stock in to ensure that if there's a prolonged strike, that they're still good, that they have inventory going into the holiday season. So smaller businesses have not been able to do that. And a reminder here, like you need a reminder, there's an election happening. So ultimately, this is going to take a center stage here, and there'll be an argument that you'll hear Trump and Vance make saying, why is Biden, letting the economy suffer right here? Why isn't he, invoking Taft-Hartley and intervening here and forcing an agreement on the unions? So without negotiations, strike looking likely tonight, folks. There's a number of things that come in through those East Coast ports, 50% of the ports. We're talking about coffee, tea, bananas. There's a majority of a lot of items here that come in via the ports. And if this lasts a while, you'll start to see things impacted at grocery stores, in stores in the coming weeks.
From the Associated Press, California Governor Gavin Newsom on Sunday vetoed a controversial artificial intelligence safety bill that pitted some of the biggest tech companies against prominent scientists who had developed the technology. Newsom said in his veto message that he decided to reject the measure because it applies only to the biggest and most expensive AI models and doesn't take into account whether they are deployed in high-risk situations. Smaller models sometimes handle critical decision-making involving sensitive data, such as electrical grids and medical records, while bigger models at times handle low-risk activities like customer service. Had Newsom signed the bill into law, it would have laid the groundwork for how AI is regulated across the U.S., as California is home to the top companies in the industry.
Yeah, so he says it didn't go far enough. He is working with AI researchers in the state. And it comes as Washington really hasn't done much. So now California is trying to get into the act here. He has signed some other bills into law this year. They include one requiring AI developers to label content created by AI as such to try to get control of these deep fakes and similar items. At the same time, when it comes to this law, you had Google, Meta, Microsoft, OpenAI all raised concerns about the bill, saying it imposed very vague standards on them in the name of safety. Many smaller companies also joined them, saying this would chill innovation here because it would prohibit developers here from releasing some of their models. And so there was a feeling, at least from a variety of sectors, including the big companies here, that this was the wrong way to go. At the same time, you had Elon Musk, as well as hundreds of former AI employees who were in support of this, saying that it was imperfect, but they need to start to go in a direction of imposing some rules on the AI companies. And Jill, we covered that hearing in the spring where the AI companies said, regulate us, make rules for us. But then when it came to this bill, they're like, make rules for us, but this is the wrong rule.
Except not this one, guys.
Not this one. This is not what we were looking for.
And finally, from Politico, Saturday Night Live began its 50th season with a parade of former co-stars, including Maya Rudolph as Vice President Kamala Harris, Andy Samberg as her husband, Doug Emhoff, and Dana Carvey as President Joe Biden. Rudolph as Harris said at a mock rally in the show's cold open, "We've got to stay focused. If we win together, we can end the dramala and the traumala and go relax in our pajamalas." After bringing out running mate Tim Walz, who's played by comedian and actor Jim Gaffigan, she invited Samberg as Emhoff to the stage and then Biden.
So, Jill, a lot of material that the campaign has provided here for SNL as it finally goes live for the season. They have a few weeks before the election here, about 5 episodes to do. Carvey, of course, is famous for his Bush 41 impression. Not going to do it. Not going to do it. In fact, Bush 41, to his credit, loved the impression so much, he invited Dana Carvey to the White House back then to do it for him in person. In fact, he invented some lines like, I don't think Bush ever said not going to do it, but Carvey said it so often at SNL that it sort of became, understood. And then, of course, you had Phil Hartman as Bill Clinton. You had some classic stuff back then. And then you had Dana Carvey, who would also play Ross Perot back then in the 90s during debates, where he played both of them. Anyway, Maya Rudolph, for her part, has won an Emmy for her impression of Kamala Harris in previous seasons. So, obviously, she was going to come back. On the Republican side, you had James Austin Johnson, who's back playing Trump at his own rally. They also showed, as part of that segment, a Trump-Vance rally, saying that he wanted Biden as his opponent instead of Harris. Remember, they tried Alec Baldwin out for a couple of years as Donald Trump there. They've been rotating through Trumps. I don't think anyone's become really iconic as Trump on SNL. With that, here's James Austin Johnson. Jill, I think some of that is actually quoted from Trump rallies in the past. He's literally said, how much he misses Joe Biden, et cetera. We've gotten to the point in politics on both sides where the SNL doesn't have to really make up that much anymore. Not much is left to the imagination. It's really just curating the ridiculousness of our existing politics for the comedians to quote back on Saturday night.
Well, I, for one, am glad that SNL is back right in time for the election.
Yeah, we'll see if they, can have. They used to have, I think, a much more of an impact. I've been, admittedly a little disappointed in SNL in recent years, but we'll see if they have any sort of iconic segment in the coming weeks. All right, now time for On This Day in History. We begin in 1938. The notorious Munich Agreement was approved today between Britain's Neville Chamberlain and Germany's Adolf Hitler. It was an attempt to appease Hitler to try to prevent a world war. It was reached on this day. It was signed after Hitler had already taken back all of Germany, Austria, a bit of Czech Republic. It was a deal basically saying, please stop taking countries in Europe. It did not stop him. World War II would start within a year. And of course, Chamberlain was stepped down for a guy named Churchill. And Munich has become sort of notorious with the idea of appeasing dictators. On this day in 1955, a 24-year-old actor, James Dean, is killed in California when his Porsche that he was driving hits another car at an intersection. Only one of James Dean's movies, East of Eden, had been released at the time of his death. He was seen as this up-and-coming star. Both Rebel Without a Cause and Giant would open afterward. After he died, he was clearly on his way to superstardom. James Dean died at 24 on this day. And we end here with a bit of music history. On this day in 1995, Mariah Carey made history when she begins an 8-week run atop the Billboard charts with Fantasy, making her the first female act to debut as a #1 hit. I can't believe it took till 1995, but that's the case.
All right, Moshe, we survived this edition of the podcast. I'm not feeling well, but you are really not feeling well. So the whole episode.
Can you tell by our voices? I need to stop talking now.
The whole background is just Moshe blowing his nose. I'm coughing.
Yeah, let's hope our editor, Arian, has cleaned up the podcast. You didn't hear all the me blowing my nose on the podcast.
All right, well, nice. Moshe, feel better, please. And everyone else, thank you for listening to the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
See you guys tomorrow, I think, if my voice is surviving.